They had everything. The most disciplined soldiers on the planet, the most powerful navy ever assembled, generals who had won wars across 3 continents, a treasury large enough to fund a decade of conflict, an empire so vast that the sun never fully set on it. And they lost, not to a comparable power, not to another empire with equivalent resources and a battle-hardened professional military. They lost to farmers, to merchants, to men who had never commanded more than a county militia, to an army that, in the early years of the conflict, did not have enough gunpowder to fight a single major battle. The British Army of the 1770s was the finest fighting force in the world. No serious military historian disputes this. Their drill, their discipline, their logistics, their officer corps, all of it was the product of generations of refinement, tested and proven across the battlefields of Europe, India, and North America itself. And yet, when it was over, they sailed home, and a new country planted its flag on the continent they left behind. The question is not whether Britain lost, the question is how. And the answer is stranger and more complicated than any simple story of heroism or incompetence can explain. Because the British Army did not fail on the battlefield. Not really. They won most of the battles they fought. They took the cities. They captured the ports. They outmaneuvered the Continental Army again and again, and they still lost the war. This is the story of how the most powerful military force of the 18th century was defeated not by the army in front of it, but by the war it was fighting. To understand how Britain lost, you have to first understand what Britain had. The British Army that arrived in America was the product of more than a century of continuous warfare. Since the English Civil War of the 1640s, Britain had been almost continuously at war somewhere in the world, against the Dutch, against the French, against the Spanish, against the Scots, against the Irish, against the Mughal Empire, against the tribes of the Ohio Valley. War was not an interruption to British life. It was an industry. The result was a professional military establishment of extraordinary sophistication. By the 1770s, British infantry regiments had standardized their drill to such a degree that a sergeant transferred from one regiment to another could begin drilling new men the following morning without a single hour of orientation. The manual of arms, the sequence of movements required to load, prime, and fire a Brown Bess musket, was so deeply trained into British soldiers that men reported performing it correctly in the dark, in chaos, under direct fire. British officers, unlike their continental counterparts, had actual combat experience. The 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763, had given a generation of British commanders, some of whom would arrive in America, direct experience of fighting in multiple theaters simultaneously. They knew what broken ground looked like. They knew how to move artillery through difficult terrain. They knew how to manage supply lines across hostile territory, and the Navy. The Royal Navy was not merely the largest in the world. It was the most technically advanced. British warships were better designed, better maintained, and better crewed than any other fleet afloat. British sailors had been at sea for decades. Their gunnery was faster, more accurate, and more sustained than anything the French or Spanish could field. And those were the second and third best navies in the world. When Britain decided to suppress the American Rebellion in 1775, they were deploying this machine. The question that historians have argued about for 250 years is why the machine failed. Here is the thing about the British Army in America that most accounts skip over. They were fighting the wrong war, not the wrong enemy, not the wrong strategy, the wrong kind of war entirely. The British Army had been built, refined, and optimized for one specific type of conflict, the European pitched battle, the set-piece engagement on a defined field where two armies deployed in formation, maneuvered for advantage, and then closed to decide the matter with volley fire and bayonet. This is what British soldiers trained for. This is what British officers planned for. This is what British military doctrine was built around. America was not a European battlefield. The continent was vast in a way that no European commander had experienced. Britain had fought in North America before, in the French and Indian War, but always as part of a conflict where the decisive action was determined by events elsewhere. In the Revolutionary War, North America was the decisive theater, and North America refused to behave like a European battlefield. The distances were staggering. Boston to Savannah was more than 1,000 miles. A British garrison in New York could not reinforce a British position in Georgia in less than weeks. The supply lines that kept British armies in the field stretched across the Atlantic Ocean, 3,000 miles of open water, and then across a continent that had almost no roads. The terrain was wrong. American forests did not allow the maneuvering of tight formations. American roads, where roads existed, turned to mud at the first rain and became impassable to heavy artillery. American rivers flooded without warning, cutting off lines of communication that had taken weeks to establish. And the population was wrong. In every European war Britain had fought, the civilian population of the contested territory was largely passive, people who wanted the fighting to end and were willing to accommodate whoever was winning. In America, roughly a third of the population actively supported the rebellion. Another third was sympathetic. Only a third was loyal. This meant that British armies could march through a region, defeat any continental force they encountered, garrison the major towns, and still not control the territory. The moment a British column moved on, the local committees of safety came back out. The local militias resumed their harassment. The loyalists who had cheered the British arrival were left exposed and vulnerable. Britain could win every battle and hold no ground. The British commanders sent to suppress the rebellion were not incompetent. This is important to understand because the temptation is to explain the British defeat by pointing at individual failures. General William Howe did outmaneuver Washington brilliantly at Long Island. He did take New York, Philadelphia, and most of New Jersey. He did inflict staggering casualties on the Continental Army in multiple engagements. General Henry Clinton, who succeeded Howe, understood the strategic situation clearly enough to articulate, in letters that historians have studied for 2 centuries, exactly why the British position was untenable. He wrote to London explaining that without naval superiority in American waters, without enough troops to garrison the entire coast, without a loyal population large enough to maintain order between British advances, the war could not be won. He was correct on every point. General John Burgoyne, whose surrender at Saratoga in 1777 brought France into the war on the American side, was an imaginative and aggressive commander whose plan was strategically coherent. It simply required coordination between 3 armies operating hundreds of miles apart without reliable communication, in terrain that none of them had fully surveyed. When the coordination failed, the plan collapsed. The problem was not the generals. The problem was what London was asking them to do: suppress a rebellion across a continent-sized territory with an army that was never large enough to occupy all of it simultaneously. Protect loyalists scattered across thousands of miles of countryside. Maintain supply lines stretching across an ocean. Fight a conventional war against an enemy that refused to fight conventionally. Win over a population that was, at minimum, indifferent and, at worst, actively hostile. No army in the 18th century could have done all of these things simultaneously. No army in the 21st century could have done all of these things simultaneously. But London kept asking, and the generals kept failing to deliver. And the gap between what London expected and what was militarily possible kept widening year after year until the gap became the war itself. There is a part of this story that rarely gets the attention it deserves. Britain's entire strategic plan for the American war rested on a single assumption that turned out to be wrong. The assumption was that there were enough loyal Americans, Tories, loyalists, people who genuinely wanted to remain part of the British Empire, to pacify each region after the British Army moved through it. The plan went like this. The army would advance. The Continental forces would be defeated or driven off. The Loyalists would then emerge, organize themselves, and maintain order. The army could move on to the next objective, leaving a loyal population behind. It never worked. In the South, where British commanders believed loyalism was strongest, the army arrived in the Carolinas in 1780 to find loyalists who were willing to fight but incapable of holding territory against Patriot militia once the British column was a day's march away. Loyalist units were raised and equipped and sent into the interior, and they were systematically destroyed by partisan commanders who knew the terrain and had the support of the local population. In New York, where British control was most complete, the Loyalist population was large enough to be a visible presence, but not large enough to project any military power beyond the city's immediate vicinity. In New England, Loyalism had effectively collapsed within months of the war's beginning. The British were trying to reconquer a continent with the help of a political minority that was too dispersed, too exposed, and too easily punished by their patriot neighbors to provide the kind of sustained, organized support the strategy required. When the strategy failed, there was no backup plan, because the strategy failing meant that the fundamental premise of the war, that most Americans wanted to remain British, was wrong. And no army, however well trained and equipped, can win a war against a population that has collectively decided it does not want to be governed by you. The single most consequential event of the Revolutionary War happened not on an American battlefield, but in a European palace. The British defeat at Saratoga in October of 1777 changed everything. Saratoga was not the largest battle of the war. It was not even the most tactically complex. What it was a British army of nearly 6,000 men surrendering in the field to an American force. The first time in the war that a substantial British force had been compelled to lay down its arms. France had been watching. France had been supplying the Americans with money, weapons, and encouragement since 1776. But France was not ready to enter the war openly until it believed the Americans could actually win. Saratoga provided that proof. Within months of the surrender, France formally recognized American independence and entered the war as an open ally. Spain followed. The Netherlands followed. And suddenly, Britain was not fighting a colonial rebellion. It was fighting a world war. The Royal Navy, that supreme instrument of British power, now had to defend British interests in the Caribbean, in the Mediterranean, off the coast of India, in the English Channel itself. The ships that had been available to support operations in America now had to be distributed across the globe. The troops that might have been sent to reinforce American garrisons were now needed in Gibraltar, in the West Indies, in Ireland, where a rebellion was simmering. The treasury that had been funding the American war now had to fund a conflict against 3 European powers simultaneously. Britain did not lose the American war because America defeated them. Britain lost the American War because America's survival forced Britain into a global conflict that stretched its resources beyond what any empire of the era could sustain. The Continental Army kept the Revolution alive long enough for the war to become something Britain could not afford to win. 1778, with France in the war and the Northern Theater stalemated, British commanders made a decision that they believed would end the conflict. They would conquer the South. The logic was sound on paper. The southern colonies, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, were believed to contain the largest concentrations of Loyalist sentiment. The terrain was more open than New England, theoretically better suited to conventional military operations. The distance from the main Continental Army's base in the north meant that Washington could not easily reinforce Southern defenses. The British took Savannah in 1778. They took Charleston in 1780, the largest American defeat of the entire war, with more than 5,000 Continental soldiers captured. They pushed deep into the Carolinas, and then the backcountry ignited. American partisan commanders operating in the Carolina interior proved impossible to destroy. They moved faster than British columns. They knew the terrain. They struck supply lines, isolated Loyalist units, and disappeared before a response could be organized. When British forces pursued, the partisans dispersed into the forest and reassembled somewhere else. The Battle of Cowpens in January of 1781 destroyed one of the best British units in the South, a force of highly trained infantry and cavalry that had been the terror of the Carolina backcountry. A Continental general used a tactical double envelopment that textbooks still discuss. The British unit was effectively eliminated. The Southern strategy had failed for the same reason every British strategy in America had failed. Winning the battles was possible. Controlling the territory after the battles was not, because control required a loyal population to maintain it, and the loyal population was not large enough, not organized enough, and not safe enough to function. The end came not through a dramatic reversal on the battlefield, but through the convergence of everything that had been going wrong for 8 years. By the autumn of 1781, the British Army in the South was exhausted. Its commander had marched his force across the Carolinas in pursuit of an American army that refused to be caught, fighting pitched battles that cost more than they yielded, watching his supply lines harassed and his Loyalist allies systematically eliminated. He withdrew his force to Yorktown, Virginia, a peninsula between two rivers, and waited for the Navy to resupply him and, if necessary, evacuate him. The Navy did not come. A French fleet under Admiral de Grasse fought the British relief fleet to a standstill in the Chesapeake Bay, and then held its position, sealing Yorktown from the sea. When Washington and the French General Rochambeau arrived with a combined force of 17,000 men and began methodical siege operations, the mathematics were simple and brutal. 8,000 British soldiers, no naval relief, no prospect of escape, dwindling supplies and ammunition, the siege lines closing day by day. The surrender on October 19, 1781, was not the formal end of the war. Fighting would continue for almost 2 more years, but it was the end of the war's credibility in London. Parliament had been debating the war's cost and purpose for years. Yorktown ended the debate. The war would not be won. The price of continuing was higher than the value of the prize. Britain negotiated, and America became a country. So why did the most powerful military force in the world lose to an army of farmers? 3 reasons, and none of them are the ones usually given. First, they were fighting a war their army was not built to fight. The British Army was an instrument of European warfare, optimized for the pitched battle, the formal siege, the decisive engagement. America did not offer any of these consistently. It offered vast distances, difficult terrain, dispersed population, and an enemy that refused to fight on terms where British training and discipline could be decisive. Second, they needed to do something their military could not achieve alone. Winning in America required not just defeating the Continental Army, but pacifying a continent, which required a loyal population large enough to maintain order between British advances. That population did not exist in sufficient numbers. So every military success evaporated the moment the army moved on, because there was nobody loyal enough to hold what the army had taken. Third, they could not isolate the conflict. The moment America survived long enough for France to enter the war, Britain's strategic situation transformed from difficult to impossible. A continental power against a colonial rebellion is a problem of resources and patience. A continental power against 3 European nations simultaneously, while simultaneously managing a rebellion, is a problem that has no military solution. Britain did not lose because their soldiers failed. Their soldiers did not fail. Britain lost because the war they were asked to win was not a war that could be won by soldiers alone. The British army that sailed home after Yorktown was not a defeated army in the conventional sense. It had won most of the battles it had fought. It had taken and held the major cities. It had inflicted casualties on the Continental Army that should have destroyed it 3 times over. And it lost the war. Because wars are not decided by battles alone. They are decided by whether the political and strategic conditions for victory can be created and maintained. Britain could create those conditions temporarily, in the immediate aftermath of a military victory. But they could not sustain them across a continent of 3 million people, 3,000 miles of ocean, and 8 years. The lesson of the American Revolution for Britain was not that their army was inadequate. The lesson was that military power has limits, that there are wars which cannot be won by force because the conditions for victory lie beyond what force can create. It is a lesson that the most powerful militaries in the world have had to relearn, in various forms, in various places, at various costs, in every century since. The British Army was the best in the world, and the war it was sent to fight was not a war the best army in the world could win. If this changed how you think about military power and its limits, hit subscribe. Every week on Reckoning, we cover the full history behind the wars, decisions, and rivalries that shape the world you live in. Drop a comment below. Do you think Britain could have won with a different strategy? We read everyone. And if you learned something today, the like button is the best way to help this channel reach more people. We will see you in the next one.